Throughout this week, I've been doing a lot of research into prescribed burning in California, and the reason I got into this is because at the beginning of the week, I had a pretty simplistic idea of prescribed burning for California. I viewed it as the solution to the wildfire problem in California because, well, there's a lot of different factors that have led to the increase in wildfire behavior that we've seen recently, and a lot of the extreme wildfires that we've had in the last decade, like severe drought, fire suppression leading to an accumulation of fuels, hotter, drier conditions, more people into the wildland-urban interface, which also leads to more wildfires happening because humans are the major source of ignition. There's lots of different factors leading to the wildfire problem, but I think my brain almost wanted there to just be a simple solution, and prescribed burning seemed like that solution because it mimics the natural California environment. California evolved with fire. A lot of our plants and animals in some ways depend on fire, or at least have adapted to it. So by doing prescribed fire, we would not only mimic nature, but then we'd also be able to solve some of the problems that we've created, like the accumulation of fuels. We put fire on the ground, clear out some of the fuels. Then if a fire happens in the future, it's not as big because, well, there's not as much fuel on the ground. But then I came across a video a couple days ago, and it turns out prescribed burning is much more nuanced than I had originally thought. And it actually is different whether you're talking about the forests or you're talking about the chaparral. So I have done a lot of research here, and I think I've come to some good conclusions, at least until I do more research and figure out why these conclusions are wrong. But here's what I figured out as of right now, and we'll start with the chaparral first. So in the chaparral, it looks like prescribed burning actually isn't what you want to be doing. And the best way to understand that is to understand the plant communities which have evolved in the California ecosystem. So up in the Sierra, you have a pretty good amount of lightning, and a lot of that lightning is going to be in the summer when you get some monsoonal activity. And if you have dry thunderstorms that can go into your fuels, it can start some fires. So that's why the fire return interval up in the Sierra is maybe around 10 to 20 years, and then that shapes a lot of the plant communities up there. And notice that a lot of that lightning is more in the summer, whereas where we see more chaparral, that's going to be closer to the California coast. And a lot of our lightning will actually be in the winter and the spring, where you're not really going to get any fires starting. And then even with that, lightning is exceptionally rare. I actually found out today the Central Coast has the lowest amount of lightning in the entire United States. And that's where a lot of the chaparral is. Pretty similar story for Southern California as well. So with less lightning, there'd be less natural ignitions, which means the plants that have evolved over thousands of years wouldn't have as frequent of fire return intervals. So, in other words, they would be used to fires happening maybe every 100 years, not every 10 years. So they would evolve because of that. So whatever is good for the plants in the chaparral is most likely going to be something that mimics that natural environment that they adapted to. So just to dive in further here, we can look at two species. There's chamise, and then there's ceanothus. So chamise, I picked this one because it's the most common chaparral plant throughout California. In fact, it's the plant that I would often do fuel sampling for because you're able to compare the fuel moisture within Northern California chamise with chamise in Southern California, and because it's evenly distributed throughout the state, fire researchers up in NorCal can compare their results to fire researchers from Southern California. And I'll get into fuel moisture in another video. You're basically taking trimmings, putting in an oven, figuring out how much moisture is in the fuel, gives you a good idea of fire danger. But with chamise, the way that it's adapted to fire, well, it's adapted in two ways. It does drop seeds that are able to pop open after a fire when a lot of the competition has been cleared out. But one of the main ways that it survives a fire is even if the entire top of the plant looks like it's completely burned off, it has what's called a burl, and that's underneath the soil. And you could think of it as a reserve of nutrients, of water, of resources so that once the fire comes through, clears out a lot of the competition, maybe even brings some more nutrients down into the ground from all of the things that have burned, almost like fertilizer. The burl resprouts, and then you get another chamise plant popping up, and it's some new growth. So you could almost think of this like fire insurance. And I learned this little metaphor from the person who's changed my mind about prescribed burning in the Chaparral. And he said the reason it's like fire insurance is because you don't exactly want a fire to burn your house down every 10 to 20 years, but you have fire insurance just in case it happens. You have some reserves that you could start over with. So just like with the chamise, it's not that it wants fire to happen every 10 to 20 years to lead to new growth, but if it does happen, then that's okay because it has its reserves built up. But here's where the fire return interval is important. If that interval gets shortened too much, then it doesn't have as much time to build up those underground reserves. And then it's not going to be able to sprout up, and then you can have maybe some invasive plants taking over instead of that chamise being able to thrive. So because it's used to maybe 100-year fire return interval, it wants to have lots of time to build up the reserves in that burl so that when a fire comes through, it's able to sprout again. If the return interval through either human ignition or prescribed burns is too short, it can actually just end up killing the chamise because it doesn't have enough time to build up its reserves. So I think we explained that one. Now let's go into Ceanothus. This is another very common chaparral plant. And this one, its main adaptive strategy is through seeds. It drops a large amount of seeds that will open up or germinate after a fire comes through. A few reasons for that. Big one is that it clears out a lot of the competition. Another one is maybe a lot of the animals are gone, so they're not going to eat as many of the new little seedlings, saplings that are popping up, the young plants. That's maybe an easier way to say it. And then on top of that, what I already explained, a lot of nutrients are now in the soil from everything that's burned. And the Ceanothus plant, in some cases, I just read this, it could drop 10,000 seeds per square yard in 1 year. Now, obviously, not all of those are going to survive. It actually helps lots of rodents, birds, and ants survive. It's a very interconnected community. But some of those do find their way into the soil, and they can sit there for 100 years, 150 years, maybe even 200 years, just waiting for their opportunity. Now, just like the chamise plant, it doesn't necessarily want a fire to come through. It doesn't need a fire to come through. But if a fire does come through and it clears out the Ceanothus plant, it has this entire seed bank that it's stored up over 100 years or 200 years that then the fire, whether it's through heat or smoke or chemicals, it kind of kicks these seeds into gear. It brings them back to life. They pop open, and then they're able to thrive in this kind of environment that is very suited to their young life before they can turn into a larger plant and then drop their own seeds. So there's a few reasons why you wouldn't want to do prescribed burning here. The main one is that you want to be able to give the Ceanothus plant time to build up that seed bank. For this one, I think of almost like if you consistently save money for emergencies. Let's say you're saving money for a few months and you save up $1,000 and then your car breaks down. Well, that's okay because you have your $1,000 and you can kind of bail yourself out. But then if your car breaks down a month later, you haven't had time to build up that savings again. So then you're probably going to have to go into debt. And that's what would happen if we do too much prescribed burning in the Chaparral, is the Ceanothus plant wouldn't be able to build up that seed bank as much, its savings account. And then if a fire came through, right after a lot of those seedlings had, so let's say a fire comes through, clears out the Ceanothus plant. All the seeds are thinking, all right, here's our time to get into action. They sprout. But then another fire comes through. Then it just kills all of those, and you don't have your natural chaparral environment anymore. Then maybe some invasive species move in, and then this is where it can get pretty bad, is oftentimes what replaces these natural chaparral plants are invasive grasses. And that's bad for a few reasons. These invasive grasses will often promote actually more fire activity, so then it's worse in terms of wildfire. And then they also don't have as extensive of root systems. So then you end up with more mudslides and flooding as well. So it's just bad on all accounts. And all the animals that depend on the chaparral for their food and resources, well, they're in big trouble as well. So through my research, it seems like prescribed burning, not a good idea in the chaparral, with an exception. And the exception there obviously would be around homes. A key thing to protect homes that are already there. It's not like you're going to tell people to just leave and sell their home. I think that'd be a pretty difficult argument to make. But then the answer would be, okay, since the home's already there and we don't want to just destroy the whole chaparral, creating a defensible space is most likely the way to go. You can do that in a few ways. You could create fire breaks, you could clear out all the vegetation, or if you want to kind of mimic the natural environment, you could use prescribed burning between a home and the chaparral to create almost a natural buffer, because the new growth that pops up afterwards, maybe the seeds that germinate or the sprouts that come out of the burrows, the new growth doesn't burn as intensely as the old growth. So it would be easier to manage in case of a wildfire. So, summary there, seems like in the chaparral, prescribed burning, not what you want to do. In fact, there's too many fires going on in the chaparral, and the fire return intervals have shortened to the point where we're losing some of the chaparral. With the exception of you would want to use it if you're creating a buffer between homes and the environment. So that's the chaparral. Now let's go over to the forest, because it's a very different story there. And the main plants I want to focus on are ponderosa pine, Jeffrey pine, and giant sequoia. And I'm actually just going to lump all of these together because it seems like they use a lot of the same adaptations, although in slightly different ways. One big thing that they do is they engage in self-pruning, where their lower branches will purposely fall off. So then if a surface fire comes through, it doesn't catch the canopy on fire, and the tree can survive. Well, then the question might pop into your head, well, doesn't the bark just catch on fire and then the tree goes up in flames? But with the pines, you have pretty thick kind of cork-like bark that is very difficult to ignite. And then in case of giant sequoias, it has a very fire-resistant bark. I believe it's filled with tannins. I think that's the word for it. That makes it fire-resistant. So a surface fire can come through. It might char the bark a little bit so it looks black around the base, but the tree is pretty much fine. And then these plants will also engage in similar activities to the chaparral plants, where their seeds or their cones are adapted to wildfire, where it actually waits for a fire to happen and then the seeds germinate, and then you get a lot of the young plants coming through in an environment that's been cleared out of competition. Now, what's happened over the last 100 years is through fire suppression, we haven't allowed the forest to kind of clean itself out. As I mentioned up in the Sierra, you have lightning a lot more frequently. So you would get fires maybe every 10 years, every 15 years, and that would clear out the surface fuels, and then these big trees would be left unharmed. And it would almost look like a park-like environment. But what happened through fire suppression, and one interesting thing about that is it almost seems like a lot of these trees are actually trying to make fire happen. For example, the needles and some of the bark that the pine trees drop on the ground actually seems like it's evolved to promote fire, because it's a way to just clear out all the ground around it and then help the survival of the pine species. Now, what happens during fire suppression is you don't allow those surface fires to happen. Then you have, I believe it was called white firs. They come in, they like the shade, and then they just crowd out the ground. And what ends up happening is you get so much of those coming in around the pines or around the giant sequoias that when the next fire comes through, it lights those on fire, and then the fire becomes so intense because it's no longer a ground fire that it's able to get up into the canopy of the pines and the giant sequoias, and then the whole ecosystem goes up in flames, and the trees that were evolved and had adaptations to survive fires are then destroyed. So then the answer there would be, in the part of the season where it's maybe not as hot and dry, it's a great idea to put some fire on the ground, clear out those fuels so that you can return the environment to what it should have been if humans hadn't kind of intervened in the first place. It's kind of making up for our mistakes in the past. And then you could also make the argument that if a fire starts naturally, or maybe even if a fire starts by a human and it's not threatening any homes or any structures or any lives, maybe just let it burn, because that's how California evolved. That's what a lot of these plants, it's actually a more healthy environment for them. And it sounds counterintuitive to just let a fire burn, but it's actually closer towards the natural environment than if we just put it out, let the fuels accumulate, and then we end up with an unhealthy forest. So the basic summary there is, in the Chaparral, it seems like prescribed fire is not what you want to do because it shortens the fire interval. Although prescribed fire could be a good idea to do between homes and the Chaparral to create a protective buffer because the new growth doesn't burn as intensely. But then up in the Sierra, where you have some forests, it is a good idea to use prescribed fire because it clears out a lot of the fuels and returns us to a much more natural environment. So hopefully you learned something throughout the course of this video. I'm going to be doing a lot more research like this throughout the wildfire season, and thanks for watching.